They didn't even lower their voices. We were seated around the long walnut table in the private dining room of my uncle's restaurant, the same place where every big family decision had always been made. Suits on one side. Laptops open. Wine poured like it was a celebration, not a verdict. My name is Alexandra Reed. I was invited that night as an afterthought, family, not business. My cousin Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, eyes sliding toward me with a smirk that told me exactly what was coming. "Let's be honest," he said, tapping the table. "This partnership isn't for everyone. We're talking real capital. Serious money." A few people laughed. Not nervously. Comfortably. My aunt added, "Alexandra lives, simply. She wouldn't want the pressure anyway." Then my brother said it. Loud enough for the servers to hear. "You're too poor for a business partnership." The word poor landed heavy. Final. Like a label they'd agreed on long ago. No one corrected him. No one asked what I thought. They went right back to discussing percentages, investors, exits, talking around me as if I'd faded into the wallpaper. I felt eyes flick toward my shoes. My watch. The absence of anything flashy that might contradict their narrative. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I folded my napkin carefully and rested my hands in my lap, breathing through the heat crawling up my neck. Because correcting them would have ruined the moment. And they deserved to finish what they started without knowing that the company they were so eager to divide already belonged to me. Mostly. I stayed quiet and let them keep talking. They had been underestimating me long before money ever entered the conversation. In my family, value was measured in volume: who spoke the loudest, who arrived in the nicest car, who knew how to turn every dinner into a performance. I never fit that mold. I didn't announce promotions. I didn't dress to impress. I learned early that attention in our family came with strings, and I preferred freedom, so I kept my life deliberately small. While Daniel leased a new car every 2 years and my brother posted about the grind, I rented a modest apartment, wore the same neutral coats season after season, and declined invitations that felt more like audits than gatherings. To them, restraint looked like lack. Silence looked like failure. What they didn't see were the nights I stayed up fixing problems no one wanted to claim. When the company's first vendor threatened to walk, I fronted the cash quietly to keep payroll from bouncing. When a bad quarter spooked an early investor, I absorbed the risk through a private note: no announcements, no credit, just solutions. I never attached my name to those moments. I didn't need applause. I needed stability. Years ago, when the business was still fragile and everyone else was chasing faster wins, I structured my involvement through a holding trust. My attorney handled the paperwork. My shares were purchased gradually, legally, invisibly, always reinvested, never flaunted. It wasn't secrecy for the sake of deception. It was protection. Family and money don't mix cleanly. I'd watched that lesson play out too many times. They assumed I stayed on the sidelines because I couldn't afford a seat at the table. In truth, I was building the table slowly, patiently, without drawing attention to the weight it could carry. And because I never challenged their assumptions, those assumptions hardened into certainty. By the time they started talking about partnerships and power, they truly believed I was irrelevant. That belief was my advantage. I let them keep it. Because when people are convinced you don't matter, they stop checking the numbers closely. And that's when the quiet work finally speaks. Once they decided I didn't belong, they stopped pretending to include me. The emails started arriving without my name on them. Subject lines like "core partners only" and "final strategy call" passed through the family group chat, followed by side conversations that went mysteriously quiet whenever I entered the room. When I asked simple questions, I was met with practiced smiles and vague answers. "Don't worry about it, Alex," my brother said once, waving me off. "This part gets technical, as if I hadn't spent years untangling the company's messiest problems while everyone else chased headlines. They began planning the deal: openly expansion, outside investors, a possible partial sale. Numbers were thrown around like confetti. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone, apparently, except me. At Sunday dinner, Daniel pulled up projections on his tablet and started walking the table through what he called the future. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed ownership came from proximity, not paperwork. "We'll split control evenly," he said. Family first. No outsiders having a say. My aunt nodded eagerly. And we'll keep decision-making among those who can actually contribute. Her eyes flicked to me for half a second, long enough to make the message clear. I was contribution adjacent. Present, but unnecessary. They talked about valuation as if it were theoretical. About authority as if it were inherited. About risk as if it had never personally cost them anything. I sat there, listening, cataloging every assumption they made. Every corner they cut. Every certainty built on incomplete information. At one point, someone joked, "We don't need dead weight slowing this down." Laughter followed. I smiled politely and took a sip of water. Inside, something settled, not anger, not hurt, but clarity. They weren't just excluding me socially. They were constructing a deal based on a fantasy of control that didn't exist. And the more confident they became, the less careful they were. That's when I understood. Correcting them now would only make them defensive. Letting them proceed would make the truth unavoidable. So I stayed quiet. I stopped asking questions. I let them believe they were alone in the room. Because the more completely they erased me from the plan, the more devastating the math would be when it finally appeared, printed, signed, and impossible to argue with. The deal moved faster once they stopped worrying about me. Within weeks, everything shifted from casual planning to formal execution. Conference rooms were booked. Outside advisors were brought in. The language changed from ideas to timelines, from possibilities to commitments. This was no longer dinner table speculation. This was a transaction that would lock in power for years. They scheduled the final meeting on a Tuesday morning at the company's downtown offices. Neutral ground, my uncle called it. Professional. Clean. I wasn't listed as a voting member on the calendar invite. Just an observer. That detail alone told me how confident they were. When I arrived, the room was already buzzing. Daniel paced near the windows, rehearsing his talking points. My brother sat at the head of the table, tapping impatient fingers against a leather folder marked confidential. Two attorneys, one internal, one external, were arranging documents with methodical precision. No one asked why I was there. They assumed I had come to watch. The lead attorney, Miss Alvarez, began outlining the transaction. New capital injection. Partial equity sale. Revised board structure. Every clause designed to consolidate authority among the active partners. It is all the Raskintonen. She paused at one point, glancing down at her notes. Before we proceed, we'll need confirmation of shareholder approval. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. That won't be a problem. We've already discussed it. Miss Alvarez didn't smile. For clarity, she said evenly, this transaction requires a majority vote, 50% plus one. My brother nodded, already reaching for a pen. We've got that covered. I watched Miss Alvarez flip to the next page, her expression unreadable. She looked up briefly, just long enough for her eyes to meet mine. There it was. The smallest hesitation. She continued anyway, explaining that the ownership structure would be read into the record before signatures could be finalized. Standard procedure. Non-negotiable. The room grew quieter as binders were passed out. Thick. Official. Heavy with numbers. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, almost kindly, "This part might be boring for you." I gave him a small smile and said nothing. Because the deal they were so eager to finalize rested on a single assumption that they already held the majority. And assumptions, once printed and read aloud, have a way of collapsing under their own weight. All that remained was for the numbers to speak. And they were about to speak very clearly. Miss Alvarez cleared her throat. "For the record," she said, "we'll begin by confirming the current ownership structure." Daniel leaned back, relaxed. My brother clicked his pen, already smiling. To them, this was a formality, something to get through before the real decisions began. Miss Alvarez started reading. Harborline Ventures, 12%. A nod from across the table. Stonebrook Capital, 9%. Someone scribbled a note. Founders Pooled Shares, 18%. Daniel glanced around, pleased. The numbers sounded familiar. Predictable. Safe. She paused, flipped a page. Reed Holdings Trust. The room barely reacted. Trusts were background noise to them, faceless entities. Paperwork without people. 61%. Silence fell so fast it felt physical. Daniel straightened. That can't be right. My brother laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. 61. That's not possible. Miss Alvarez didn't look up. Reed Holdings Trust holds 61% of the issued shares as of the last filing. She finally raised her eyes. Beneficial owner. Alexandra Reed. Every head turned toward me. I didn't move. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the building's HVAC system seemed suddenly loud, intrusive, like it was filling the space where certainty had just collapsed. That's Daniel started, then stopped. You're joking. I met his gaze calmly. No. My brother pushed his chair back slightly. There has to be a mistake. Alex doesn't, she couldn't have. Miss Alvarez cut in, professional and precise. The shares were acquired over several years through legally executed transactions. All documentation has been reviewed. There is no error. She slid a folder across the table. You'll find the purchase history and filings inside. No one reached for it. I spoke then, quietly. I never said I didn't have money. They stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language. I said I lived simply. I continued. There's a difference. I have a trust. Images flashed across their faces. Confusion, disbelief, something close to fear. The room no longer felt like theirs. The confidence they'd worn so easily drained away, replaced by frantic recalculation. Daniel swallowed. Since when? Since the early days, I said. When no one wanted to take the risk. When keeping the company alive mattered more than who got credit. My brother's voice dropped. Why didn't you tell us? I thought of the dinner. The laughter. The word poor. You never asked, I said. And when you did, you already had your answer. Miss Alvarez folded her hands. Given this structure, Miss Reed holds majority control. Without her approval, the transaction cannot proceed. The deal, the one they'd built without me, stopped existing in that instant. Not because I raised my voice, but because the numbers did exactly what they were meant to do. They told the truth. The silence didn't last long. It cracked first with nervous laughter, then with voices stepping over each other, trying to fill the space before it solidified into something permanent. Daniel recovered quickly, or thought he did. Well, he said, forcing a smile, this changes things. But in a good way, right? We're all on the same team here. My brother leaned forward, elbows on the table. Yeah. Family. This is actually great news, Alex. We always knew you were capable. Al. Always. The word hung there, heavy with revision. Moments ago, I had been an observer. Too poor to matter. Now they spoke as if my ownership had been common knowledge, as if exclusion had never happened. My aunt reached for my hand but stopped short, settling for a sympathetic look. You should have said something sooner, she sighed. We might have done things differently. Done what differently? Respected me earlier? Miss Alvarez watched silently, pen poised, the only one in the room who didn't need to pretend. Daniel flipped through the folder at last, his confidence unraveling page by page. So, technically, he said carefully, we can still make this work if we restructure. Maybe adjust the board. You'd obviously have a seat. A seat? I repeated, not raising my voice. The room stilled again. My brother cleared his throat. Alex, let's not focus on what was said before. Emotions were high. You know how these meetings get. I looked at him. You called me poor. His face flushed. That was taken out of context. I shook my head slightly. It was the context. They began talking faster than apologies layered with justifications, support laced with self-preservation. No one said I was wrong. They said we all misunderstood. History was being rewritten in real time. I listened without interrupting, noticing how quickly tone shifted when power did. How respect arrived not with understanding but with leverage. Finally, Miss Alvarez spoke. Shall we proceed? I leaned back in my chair. No, I said simply. The word landed harder than any argument. The room froze again, this time with clarity. Their panic wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about the realization that the person they'd dismissed now held the pen and that apologies, when delayed long enough, stopped being currency. They had assumed power was inherited. They were learning it was owned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture. I didn't need to. Ownership has a language of its own, and it doesn't require emotion. I asked Miss Alvarez to suspend the transaction indefinitely. No renegotiation, no revised terms. Just a clean halt. She noted it without hesitation and closed her folder. Daniel started to protest, but I held up a hand, not sharply, just enough. He stopped. Next, I exercised my right to review executive authority. Roles that had been assumed, not earned, were suddenly subject to vote. Titles lost their permanence when they were no longer protected by illusion. My brother stared at the table, jaw tight. For the first time, he understood that influence without ownership is just noise. I didn't remove anyone out of spite. I removed uncertainty. I offered buyouts fair, documented, final to those who no longer aligned with the company's future. Some accepted quickly. Others hesitated, hoping emotion would sway me. It didn't. This wasn't punishment. It was correction. Family ties had shielded inefficiency for years. I ended that quietly. By the time the meeting adjourned, the structure was clean. Authority was clear. Decisions had a single spine instead of a tangle of opinions. As I stood to leave, Daniel finally spoke. So that's it. I met his eyes. That's governance. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing monumental had happened. Cars passed, phones rang. Life continued. Inside that boardroom, something fundamental had shifted. They learned what I'd known for years. Ownership isn't about control over people. It's about responsibility for outcomes. And once you accept that responsibility, sentiment stops outweighing truth. Because power, when exercised properly, doesn't threaten. It settles. I didn't celebrate when it was over. There was no victory lap, no dramatic exit. I left the building the same way I had entered, quietly, without spectacle. Power didn't feel loud in my hands. It felt precise. For years, they mistook my silence for absence. My restraint for weakness. I let them, because correcting them would have required explaining myself to people who weren't listening. The truth is, I never needed their approval. I needed clarity. Money didn't change who I was that day. Ownership didn't either. It only revealed who everyone else had been all along. I learned something simple and permanent. People respect results, not intention. They believe documents before they believe character. And that's why silence mattered. I didn't argue when they called me poor. I didn't interrupt when they erased me from the room. I let the numbers speak. They always do. And when they do, they don't raise their voice. They end the conversation. If this story resonated with you, I want you to know you're not alone. I spent years being underestimated because I stayed quiet, because I didn't perform success the way others expected. And if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or written off by people who never bothered to look deeper, I see you. Here's what I learned, and what I hope you carry into your own life. Silence is not weakness when it's chosen. You don't owe everyone an explanation. You don't need to prove yourself to people who have already decided who you are. Let your work, your preparation, and your boundaries speak when the time is right. If you support the way I handled this, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in my place. Share your story. Your quiet wins matter too. And if you want more stories like this about boundaries, self-respect, and power done right, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and stay part of this conversation. Your voice belongs here.